He had no idea that the poised woman sheltering under a designer umbrella was Catherine "Cat" Morrison, heir to the largest agricultural empire in the Southeast and owner of over 50,000 acres across 3 states. With nothing more than a neighborly wave, he secured the tow chain to her luxury sedan, completely unaware that this simple act of kindness would save his family's century-old peach orchard and catapult him into a world of agricultural innovation he never dreamed possible. Before we dive into this incredible story, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The summer of 2023 had been merciless to Sullivan Orchards. Jake stood on the wraparound porch of his great-grandfather's farmhouse, watching sheets of rain pound what should have been rows of ripening peaches. At 29, his calloused hands told the story of someone who'd been fighting an uphill battle for far too long. The coffee in his chipped ceramic mug had gone cold an hour ago, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the devastation spreading across his fields. The 150-acre orchard in rural Elijah, Georgia, had been in the Sullivan family since 1898, passed down through for generations of peach farmers who had weathered the Great Depression, droughts, and economic downturns. But Jake might be the last. A late frost in March had destroyed 80% of his crop, and now this week-long deluge was threatening to wash away what little remained. Behind him, the old farmhouse creaked under the assault of wind and rain. The Victorian-era structure, with its peeling white paint and sagging front steps, had seen better days. Much like everything else on the property, his grandfather's prize-winning peach trees, some over 60 years old, stood like defeated soldiers in the flooded fields. These weren't just trees to Jake, they were living monuments to his family's legacy, each one planted with hope and tended with the kind of devotion that only came from generations of accumulated wisdom. The numbers painted a grim picture that kept Jake awake most nights. 3 months behind on the mortgage, equipment that should have been replaced a decade ago, and crop insurance that barely covered a quarter of his losses. The bank had been patient. Elijah was a small community where everyone knew everyone, but patience had limits. His relationship with Martha Henderson at First National went back to elementary school, which made the conversations even more painful. "I know what this place means to you, Jake," she'd said during their last meeting, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. "But I've got a board to answer to, and they're asking hard questions. 2 more missed payments, and First National would foreclose." The letter sat on his kitchen counter, its official language a stark reminder that 125 years of Sullivan family legacy could end with him. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his younger sister Emma, away at the University of Georgia, studying agricultural business. "Saw the weather reports. How bad is it?" He stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Emma had dreams of modernizing the orchard, bringing in new techniques she was learning in school. She spoke passionately about sustainable farming practices, direct-to-consumer marketing, and agritourism opportunities. But dreams required a foundation to build on, and that foundation was literally washing away beneath his feet. He thought about his grandfather, Samuel Sullivan, who taught him everything about growing peaches, soil management, and reading weather patterns. Samuel had survived the drought of 1986 that killed half the orchards in North Georgia. He'd adapted when grocery chains started demanding perfect-looking fruit that could survive long shipping distances. He'd even embraced pick-your-own operations when the economics shifted in the 1990s. "The land will take care of you if you take care of it," Samuel used to say, his weathered hands gesturing toward the rolling hills dotted with peach trees. "But you got to listen to what it's telling you, and you got to be willing to change when change is needed." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Sullivan Orchards had once supplied peaches to restaurants throughout Atlanta and had been featured in Southern Living magazine for their heirloom Alberta variety. The farm stand that his grandmother had started in 1967 used to draw customers from as far away as Tennessee, all seeking the perfect Georgia peach that could only be found at Sullivan's. Now he was rationing groceries and wondering if he could afford to keep the electricity on through August. The rain showed no signs of letting up. In fact, the Weather Service had issued flash flood warnings for the entire county. Creek beds that had been bone dry just days ago were now raging torrents, and the access road that connected his property to Highway 515 had become a treacherous mud pit that claimed at least one vehicle every major storm. Jake had seen it happen before, city folks taking GPS shortcuts through the rural backroads, only to find themselves hopelessly stuck when their sedans met Georgia clay. Usually, he'd just wave from the porch and let them figure it out themselves. He had enough problems without taking on other people's poor navigation choices. But today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the weight of the foreclosure notice, or the memory of his grandfather's voice reminding him that neighbors helped neighbors. Regardless of circumstances, Samuel had pulled plenty of strangers out of ditches over the years, never asking for payment, never expecting anything in return except maybe a wave and a thank you. As if summoned by his thoughts, a flash of headlights cut through the gray afternoon gloom, moving slowly along that very road. Jake watched as the vehicle, something expensive and sleek, that definitely didn't belong on a muddy farm road, slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether. Even from his porch, he could see the wheels spinning uselessly, the car rocking slightly as the driver tried to power through what was probably a foot-deep puddle of liquefied clay. City folk, he muttered, but without the usual irritation. Today, watching someone else struggle with forces beyond their control felt uncomfortably familiar. He set down his coffee mug and pulled on his grandfather's old rain slicker. The yellow plastic cracked and faded, but still waterproof after decades of Georgia storms. The barn doors groaned in protest as he pushed them open, revealing his pride and shame. A 1978 John Deere 4440 that had belonged to his father. The tractor had seen better days. Primer spots dotted the green paint, and the engine required a specific sequence of curses and prayers to start. But it still had enough power to pull a stuck car from the mud. As Jake climbed into the worn seat, muscle memory guiding his hands to the familiar controls, he couldn't help but wonder if this would be one of the last times he'd perform this ritual. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a sound that had provided the soundtrack to his entire childhood. Whatever happened with the farm, he'd miss that sound most of all. Jake guided the massive John Deere down the gravel driveway, its oversized tires cutting through puddles that would have swallowed a pickup truck whole. The rain continued its relentless assault, turning the world into a watercolor painting where everything bled together in shades of gray and green. As he approached the stuck vehicle, he could make out more details through the rhythmic sweep of his windshield wipers. It was a Tesla Model S, midnight blue with chrome trim that somehow still managed to gleam despite being coated in Georgia red clay. The car sat at an awkward angle in what used to be a shallow drainage ditch, but had become a small pond over the past week. Whoever was driving had made the classic mistake of thinking an expensive car could handle what generations of locals knew required either a tractor or a very good relationship with God. Through the Tesla's rear window, Jake could see a figure hunched over what appeared to be a phone, probably trying to get cell service in an area where the nearest tower was 15 miles away. The irony of someone in a $100,000 electric vehicle being stranded in the same mud that had been trapping travelers since before the Civil War wasn't lost on him. As Jake positioned his tractor for the best angle to pull the car free, the Tesla's driver door opened. He expected to see a harried businessman or a lost tourist, maybe someone who'd tried to avoid interstate traffic by cutting through the scenic route. Instead, a woman emerged with the kind of composure that spoke of someone accustomed to handling unexpected situations. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had somehow survived the humidity. Despite the circumstances, she moved with confidence, pulling a compact umbrella from the car and opening it in one fluid motion. Her clothing was expensive but not impractical, dark jeans that actually looked like they'd been worn before, waterproof hiking boots that cost more than Jake's monthly grocery budget, and a lightweight rain jacket that probably had more technology woven into its fabric than his entire tractor. What struck Jake most was her expression. No panic, no frustration at finding herself stuck in the middle of nowhere during a downpour. If anything, She looked almost amused by the situation, as if getting trapped in a Georgia mud pit was simply another interesting challenge to navigate. Jake shut off the tractor and climbed down, immediately sinking ankle-deep into the soupy mixture of clay and rainwater. The woman watched his approach with curious eyes that seemed to be cataloging every detail of his appearance, from his grandfather's faded rain slicker to the John Deere cap that had seen better decades. Afternoon. Jake called out over the sound of rain drumming against his hood. "Looks like you found yourself in a bit of a situation." "That's certainly one way to put it," she replied, and Jake was surprised by her voice. He'd expected the clipped tones of someone from Atlanta or further north, but there was something softer in her accent, hints of the South that suggested she hadn't always lived in whatever urban environment had produced that expensive car and designer rain gear. "GPS send you this way?" Jake asked, beginning his assessment of how best to extract the Tesla without damaging either vehicle. The car was stuck good and proper, but it wasn't the worst he'd seen. A few years back, he'd pulled out a Porsche, whose owner had been convinced that all-wheel drive meant the same thing as all-terrain capability. "Something like that," she said with a slight smile, plus a healthy overconfidence in modern engineering versus traditional Georgia clay. She gestured toward her car with a self-deprecating laugh. "I should have known better, really. I grew up not too far from here." That explained the accent. Jake found himself reassessing his assumptions about city folk lost in the country. "Whereabout?" "Dahlonega originally, then Atlanta for college and work. Been traveling a lot lately. Consulting on agricultural projects across the Southeast." She paused, studying his face as if deciding how much to share. "I was actually heading to look at some property nearby when I decided to take the scenic route." Clearly, that was optimistic given the weather. Agricultural consulting. That was unexpected. Jake had figured her for a lawyer or maybe someone in tech, not someone who'd understand the complexities of farming in North Georgia. He found himself curious about what kind of consulting work brought someone in a Tesla to rural Gilmer County during flood season. "Well, the scenic route will definitely test your vehicle's limits," Jake said, pulling a heavy chain from the back of his tractor, "but we'll have you out of here in no time. Might want to get back in your car while I hook this up, though. No sense in both of us getting soaked. I'd rather see how it's done." "If you don't mind," she said, adjusting her umbrella to provide some shelter as Jake worked. "I like to understand how things work." Most people would have gratefully retreated to their dry car, leaving Jake to handle the messy business of securing tow chains and working in the mud. Her insistence on staying outside, watching and asking intelligent questions about the process, marked her as different from the usual stranded motorists he encountered. "You've done this before," she observed as Jake efficiently attached the chain to the Tesla's frame, careful to avoid any of the vehicle's electronic components. "Once or twice," Jake replied, checking the connection points. "This road catches at least one car every big storm. Most folks see scenic route on their GPS and think it's just a prettier way to get where they're going. They don't realize some of these roads haven't been properly maintained since the Works Progress Administration, and you always come out to help." Jake paused in his work, considering the question. "My grandfather always said that if you can help someone and choose not to, you're part of the problem. Besides," he added with a grin, "it's not like I had anywhere urgent to be." As he secured the last connection and prepared to return to his tractor, she called out, "I'm Catherine Morrison. By the way, most people call me Cat." "Jake Sullivan," he replied, touching the brim of his cap in a gesture his grandfather had taught him decades ago. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Morrison. Though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Oh, I don't know," Kat said, that amused expression returning to her face. "Sometimes the most interesting encounters happen in the most unexpected places." Beat 3. The helper revealed the extraction process went smoothly, the old John Deere proving once again that there were some problems that could only be solved with enough torque and the right attitude. Jake worked the clutch and throttle with the kind of intuitive precision that came from years of coaxing maximum performance from aging equipment. The Tesla came free with a satisfying squelch, rolling backward onto a more solid ground where its high-tech traction control systems could actually function. Kat Morrison had moved to higher ground to watch the process, but Jake noticed she kept her attention divided between the rescue operation and the surrounding landscape. Her eyes lingered on his peach trees, studying the orderly rows and the sophisticated irrigation system his grandfather had installed in the 1980s. When she looked toward the farmhouse and outbuildings, it was with the assessing gaze of someone who understood what she was seeing. "Impressive operation," she commented as Jake unhitched the tow chain. "Peach orchard?" "Fourth generation," Jake replied, feeling the familiar mix of pride and worry that accompanied any discussion of the farm. "Sullivan Orchards, been growing peaches here since 1898. "I know the name," Kat said, and something in her tone made Jake look up sharply. "Sullivan's Albertus, right? I've seen your peaches at the Atlanta Farmers Market. Or used to." Anyway, the casual mention of his family's former glory days hit harder than Jake expected. "Yeah, well, that was before the frost got most of this year's crop. Market presence isn't what it used to be." Kat nodded sympathetically, but Jake caught something else in her expression, a calculating look that suggested she understood more about his situation than a casual farmer's market customer should. Before he could analyze it further, she was reaching into her jacket pocket. "I need to pay you something for this," she said, producing what looked like an expensive leather wallet. "You've saved me hours of waiting for a tow truck, assuming I could even get one out here in this weather." "No need," Jake said automatically, already heading back toward his tractor. "Just being neighborly." "I insist," Kat replied firmly. "At least let me cover your fuel costs." And she paused, seeming to make a decision. "I'd like to give you my card. I meant what I said about agricultural consulting, and I think there might be some opportunities that could benefit your operation." Jake found himself in the awkward position of wanting to refuse charity, while being desperately curious about what kind of opportunities someone like Kat Morrison might have in mind. His financial situation left little room for pride, but accepting help from a stranger felt like another step down a path. He wasn't sure he wanted to travel. "What kind of consulting?" he asked, accepting the business card she extended toward him. The card was heavy stock, expensive printing, with a logo he didn't recognize. "Catherine Morrison, Agricultural Development Specialist, Morrison Land and Development Group." It read, followed by a phone number and email address. On the back, she'd written something in neat handwriting. "Ask me about heritage fruit programs." "CM Heritage Fruit Programs," Jake read aloud. "Exactly what it sounds like," Kat said, her enthusiasm becoming more evident. "There's a growing market for heirloom varieties. Traditional farming methods, agritourism experiences. People want authentic connections to their food, and they're willing to pay premium prices for it." Jake had heard similar pitches before, usually from well-meaning agricultural extension agents or consultants who didn't understand the practical realities of farming on thin margins. But something about Kat's delivery suggested she knew what she was talking about. The way she'd recognized his operation, the specific mention of Alberta peaches, the casual familiarity with agricultural terminology. It all pointed to someone with genuine expertise. "I appreciate the thought," Jake said carefully, "but I'm not sure heritage programs are in the budget right now. Kind of got my hands full just keeping the lights on." Kat studied his face for a moment, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his attempt at casual dismissal to the financial desperation underneath. When she spoke, her voice was gentler, more personal. "I understand. And I'm not talking about some expensive consultant coming in to tell you how to run your family business. What I'm talking about is connecting operations like yours with markets and resources that already exist. No upfront costs, no risk to your current operation." "Sounds too good to be true," Jake said, but he pocketed the card anyway. "It might be," Kat admitted with refreshing honesty, "but it might not. Either way, the conversation doesn't cost anything except time. And I suspect you've got more of that than money right now." The blunt assessment of his situation should have stung, but somehow it felt more like understanding than judgment. Jake found himself nodding before he could stop himself. "The number on the back is my direct line," Kat continued, returning to her car. "Call me when you've had a chance to think about it. Or don't, no pressure either way." But Jake She paused with her hand on the car door. That orchard of yours has potential that goes way beyond what you're currently doing with it. Sometimes all it takes is someone with the right connections to unlock that potential. As Cat Morrison's Tesla disappeared around the bend, its taillights fading into the gray afternoon, Jake stood in the rain for a long moment, turning her business card over in his hands. The expensive cardstock was already beginning to soften from the moisture, but the printing remained crisp and professional. Morrison Land and Development Group. The name tickled something in the back of his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. The rain was finally beginning to ease, shifting from the torrential downpour that had dominated the past week to a steady drizzle that suggested the storm system might be moving on. Jake looked across his flooded fields, mentally calculating how long it would take for the water to recede enough to assess the damage to his remaining crop. Heritage fruit programs. The phrase echoed in his mind as he drove the tractor back to the barn. He'd heard similar concepts before. The Agricultural Extension Office was always promoting some new initiative or market opportunity, but most of them required startup capital he didn't have or resulted in profit margins so thin they weren't worth the additional work involved. But Cat Morrison hadn't sounded like a government bureaucrat or an academic theorist. She'd known about his peaches, recognized the Sullivan name from the Atlanta markets. That suggested genuine familiarity with the specialty agriculture scene in North Georgia. Not just textbook knowledge. Back in the farmhouse, Jake made a fresh pot of coffee and settled at his kitchen table with Cat's business card and his laptop. The house felt different with the storm finally breaking. Less like a bunker under siege and more like the comfortable family home it had always been. Afternoon light filtered through windows that his great-grandmother had installed, casting familiar shadows across walls lined with for generations of family photographs. A quick internet search for Morrison Land and Development Group yielded more results than Jake had expected. The company's website was professionally designed but understated, focusing on agricultural development projects across the Southeast. Case studies highlighted successful partnerships with small and medium-sized farms, specialty crop initiatives, and something called heritage agriculture preservation programs. Jake clicked through project descriptions that sounded almost too good to be true. A struggling apple orchard in North Carolina that had tripled its revenue through heritage variety cultivation and direct marketing programs. A small vineyard in Virginia that had transformed from near bankruptcy to regional recognition through partnership with Morrison's consulting group. A pecan farm in South Georgia that had diversified into agritourism and value-added products. With Morrison's guidance, the more he read, the more impressive Cat Morrison's credentials became. She held degrees in agricultural economics and sustainable agriculture from the University of Georgia, had worked for the USDA's specialty crop program, and served on the board of several agricultural preservation organizations. Her bio mentioned consulting work with farms across 12 states, and experience in heritage seed preservation, sustainable farming practices, and agricultural tourism development. But it was the About Us section that made Jake stop reading and reach for his coffee mug with hands that trembled slightly. Morrison Land and Development Group was described as a family-owned company, dedicated to preserving agricultural heritage while ensuring economic viability for working farms. The company had been founded in 1987 by James Morrison, who had built it into one of the Southeast's most respected agricultural development firms. Before passing leadership to his daughter Catherine in 2019, Jake's grandfather had mentioned the Morrison name before. James Morrison had been involved in several high-profile agricultural preservation projects in North Georgia during the 1990s, including the effort to save historic peach orchards from suburban development. If Cat was James Morrison's daughter, she came from agricultural royalty, people who moved in circles that included state senators, university researchers, and the kind of investors who could write seven-figure checks for projects they believed in. Her, the realization put their roadside encounter in an entirely different light. Cat Morrison hadn't been just another lost tourist. She'd been someone who could probably buy his entire operation without checking her bank balance. Someone who chose to stand in the rain asking intelligent questions about tractor hydraulics, instead of waiting in her car for the hired help to solve her problem. Jake found himself remembering details from their conversation that had seemed casual at the time, but now took on additional significance. The way she'd studied his orchard with professional interest, her immediate recognition of his family name and their former market presence, the specific mention of heritage fruit programs, as if she'd already been thinking about his farm in that context. Had their meeting been as accidental as it seemed? Jake pushed the thought away as soon as it formed. The idea that someone like Cat Morrison would orchestrate getting stuck in a mud pit just to meet a struggling peach farmer was absurd. But the possibility that she'd been in the area for professional reasons, that she might have already known about Sullivan Orchards before their chance encounter, was less far-fetched. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Power back on here. How are things at the farm?" Jake stared at the message, unsure how to explain that he'd spent the afternoon pulling a potential investor out of a ditch, without realizing who she was until after she'd driven away. Instead, he typed back, "Storm's passing. Might have an interesting opportunity to discuss when you're home next weekend." Emma's response was immediate. "Good interesting or too good to be true interesting?" "Not sure yet," Jake replied, which was the most honest answer he could give. He set the phone aside and returned his attention to Kat's business card, focusing on the handwritten note on the back. "Ask me about heritage fruit programs, CM." The message was simple enough, but Jake found himself analyzing the handwriting like it might reveal hidden meanings. The script was confident, educated, the kind of penmanship that suggested expensive private schools and careful attention to detail. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and shafts of late afternoon sunlight were beginning to break through the cloud cover. Jake could hear water dripping from the farmhouse gutters, and the distant sound of his neighbor's cattle lowing as they emerged from whatever shelter they'd found during the storm. Normal sounds of a normal day returning to normal routines. But Jake felt anything but normal. Cat Morrison's business card seemed to radiate possibility in a way that made him simultaneously hopeful and deeply suspicious. In his experience, opportunities that sounded too good to be true usually were, and people who could afford to drive Tesla sedans down muddy farm roads rarely had the best interests of struggling farmers at heart. On the other hand, his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and you got to be wise enough to recognize it when it shows up. Jake looked around his kitchen, taking in the chipped countertops, the ancient refrigerator humming. In the corner, the stack of bills that seemed to grow taller every day despite his efforts to keep up with payments. The contrast between his reality and Cat Morrison's apparent affluence was stark enough to make him wonder what someone like her could possibly gain from helping someone like him, unless, of course, the help came with strings attached. Jake had heard enough stories about agricultural consultants and development companies that promised the world while quietly positioning themselves to acquire struggling farms at below-market prices. The question was whether Cat Morrison represented a legitimate opportunity for collaboration, or simply a more sophisticated version of the same predatory practices he'd been avoiding for months. The only way to find out was to make the call. But not today, Jake decided. Today he needed to assess the storm damage, check on his remaining trees, and try to calculate whether enough of his crop had survived to make a difference in his financial situation. Today he needed to focus on the immediate crisis rather than chasing possibilities that might or might not materialize. But as he slipped Kat's business card into the kitchen drawer where he kept important documents, Jake found himself hoping that for once in his life, something that seemed too good to be true might actually turn out to be exactly as good as it appeared. Or 3 days later, Jake found himself staring at that same business card while nursing his third cup of coffee and watching the sun rise over fields that looked like a war zone. The storm damage was worse than he'd initially calculated. Nearly half of his remaining trees showed signs of root damage from the flooding, and the few peaches that had survived the March frost were now scattered across the ground like abandoned tennis balls he'd spent the previous day walking every row marking trees that might be salvageable and documenting the damage for his insurance adjuster. The numbers were brutal. Even in the best-case scenario, this year's harvest would generate less than 20% of the revenue he needed to stay current on his mortgage payments. Emma had driven up from Athens the night before, taking one look at his face and the devastation in the fields before pulling him into a hug that lasted longer than either of them usually tolerated. She'd spent the evening helping him photograph the damage and updating the spreadsheets that tracked every aspect of the farm's finances, her agricultural business coursework providing useful context for their increasingly desperate situation. "We need to consider all options," she'd said over a dinner of leftover pizza and carefully measured optimism, including some that might not have made sense a week ago. Now, with Emma asleep in her childhood bedroom and the farmhouse quiet except for the familiar sounds of an old house settling into another day, Jake found himself holding Kat Morrison's business card and her direct phone number. He'd looked up Morrison Land and Development Group twice more since their encounter, each search revealing additional details that made her credentials even more impressive, and her interest in his struggling orchard even more puzzling. The rational part of his mind insisted that people like Kat Morrison didn't pull over to help stranded farmers out of altruistic motives, but the desperate part of his mind, the part that had been calculating and recalculating his financial options for months without finding a viable path forward, whispered that maybe this once the universe had decided to throw him a lifeline instead of another obstacle. Jake picked up his phone, entered Kat's number, then set it down again. It was barely 7 a.m. too early for a business call, even to someone who'd specifically said to contact her. He needed more coffee, maybe some breakfast, definitely a clearer sense of what he hoped to accomplish with the conversation. But as he moved around the kitchen, starting another pot of coffee and considering whether he had enough eggs for breakfast, Jake's eyes kept returning to the business card on the table. "Ask me about heritage fruit programs, CM." The message seemed to be calling to him, promising answers to questions he wasn't sure he knew how to ask. By 8:30, with Emma awake and sharing coffee on the front porch, while they watched the morning mist rise from the flooded fields, Jake had made his decision. "I'm going to call her," he announced, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Emma looked up from her mug, eyebrows raised. "The consultant from the other day, Kat Morrison, Morrison Land and Development Group. I've been researching her company, and either she's the answer to our prayers or she's the most sophisticated con artist in North Georgia. Only one way to find out," Emma said practically. "But Jake, whatever she's offering, make sure you understand exactly what she wants in return. People don't usually hand out miracles without expecting something substantial in exchange." Jake nodded, appreciating his sister's caution even as he felt a growing conviction that this call represented his last best chance to save the family farm. He dialed Kat's number before he could change his mind, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before her familiar voice answered. "Catherine Morrison, Ms. Morrison. This is Jake Sullivan, from the other day. You gave me your card after I pulled your car out of the mud." "Jake, of course, I was hoping you'd call." Her voice warmed noticeably, and Jake found himself relaxing slightly. "How are things at the orchard? I know that storm system hung around your area for several more days." "That's actually why I'm calling," Jake said, settling into the honesty that seemed to work best with Kat Morrison. "The damage was worse than I initially thought. I'm looking at maybe 20% of normal harvest, and that's being optimistic. My sister thinks I should explore all available options, including some that might not have made sense a week ago." "I'm sorry to hear about the damage, but I'm glad you called," Kat replied. "Are you available to meet sometime this week? I'd like to see your operation firsthand and discuss some possibilities that might interest you. No obligation, of course, just a conversation about potential opportunities." Jake found himself agreeing to a meeting before he'd fully processed the implications. They settled on Thursday afternoon, giving him time to clean up the worst of the storm damage and prepare for what felt like the most important business meeting of his life. After ending the call, Jake sat on the porch beside Emma, both of them staring out at the damaged orchard while processing what had just happened. "Well," Emma said finally, I guess we're about to find out what Cat Morrison really wants." "Yeah," Jake agreed, feeling a mixture of anticipation and apprehension that reminded him of being called to the principal's office as a kid. "I just hope we're smart enough to recognize a good opportunity when we see it, and wise enough to avoid a trap if that's what this turns out to be." As they sat in the morning sun, watching their flooded fields slowly begin to dry out, neither of them could have imagined just how dramatically their lives were about to change. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed major storm systems in North Georgia. Jake stood on his front porch at 6 a.m., coffee steaming in the cool air, surveying his property with the mixture of pride and despair that had become his default emotional state. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a landscape that looked like nature's own before and after disaster photo. Emma had returned to Athens the previous evening, but not before helping him spend 2 days cleaning up the worst of the storm damage. They'd hauled fallen branches, cleared debris from irrigation lines, and assessed which of his remaining peach trees might be salvageable. The work had been backbreaking, but it had also given Jake time to think about his upcoming meeting with Cat Morrison. The more he'd researched her background, the more questions had emerged about why someone of her caliber would be interested in his struggling operation. Morrison Land and Development Group wasn't just successful, it was legendary in agricultural circles throughout the Southeast. James Morrison had built the company from scratch, starting as a small consulting firm in the 1980s and growing it into an agricultural development powerhouse that had saved dozens of family farms from bankruptcy while preserving thousands of acres of farmland from suburban sprawl. Cat Morrison hadn't just inherited the company. She'd earned her position through a combination of academic achievement and practical experience that read like a resume designed to impress agricultural professionals. Master's degrees from both UGA and Cornell, internships with the USDA, and several major agricultural research institutions, consulting work on heritage crop preservation projects across 3 continents. She'd taken over Morrison Land and Development in 2019 and had immediately expanded the company's focus to include sustainable agriculture initiatives and heritage preservation programs. But it was an article Jake had found in the previous evening's research that had really caught his attention. A profile piece in Southern Agriculture Quarterly from 2022 had featured Cat Morrison as one of 40 under 40 agricultural innovators to watch. The article had mentioned her personal passion for preserving traditional fruit varieties, particularly heirloom peach cultivars that were disappearing from commercial production. "We're losing genetic diversity at an alarming rate," she'd been quoted as saying. "Every time a heritage orchard gets sold to developers or converted to commercial varieties, we lose centuries of careful breeding and adaptation to local conditions. My goal is to prove that heritage agriculture can be both economically viable and environmentally sustainable." The article had included a sidebar about Morrison Land and Development's Heritage Fruit Initiative, a program that partnered with family orchards to preserve rare varieties while developing premium markets for their products. The program provided technical support, marketing assistance, and most importantly, guaranteed purchase contracts that allowed participating farms to transition away from conventional wholesale markets toward direct consumer and specialty restaurant sales. Reading about the Heritage Fruit Initiative had given Jake his first real surge of hope in months. It sounded exactly like what Sullivan Orchards needed, a way to leverage their heirloom Alberta variety and historic reputation, while generating the revenue necessary to modernize their operation and secure their financial future. But the article had also made clear that Morrison was selective about her partnerships, choosing only farms with exceptional heritage credentials and strong potential for success. Now, as Jake finished his morning coffee and prepared to spend a few hours making his property look as presentable as possible before Cat's afternoon visit, he found himself wondering whether Sullivan Orchards would meet her standards. Their Alberta peaches were indeed heritage varieties, planted by his great-grandfather using stock that traced back to the original cultivar developed in Georgia in the 1870s. The farm's history and reputation were solid, even if their current financial situation was dire. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Kat Morrison's interest in his farm went beyond simple business considerations. Something about their roadside encounter had felt orchestrated, as if she'd known exactly who he was and what his situation entailed. Before he'd pulled her Tesla out of the mud, the possibility made him simultaneously hopeful and deeply suspicious. Jake spent the morning power washing the farmhouse porch, mowing the areas around the buildings that hadn't been flooded, and generally trying to make Sullivan Orchards look like a viable business operation rather than a disaster area. Emma had suggested that he wear something nicer than his usual work clothes, but Jake had decided to stick with clean jeans and a button-down shirt. That split the difference between professional and practical. By noon, he was as ready as he could be. The farmhouse looked respectable. He'd prepared a folder with basic information about the orchard's history and current operations, and he'd even managed to salvage enough undamaged peaches to put together a small tasting selection that showcased the superior flavor of their heirloom varieties. Kat Morrison arrived precisely at 2 p.m., driving the same Tesla that Jake had rescued from the mud 3 days earlier. This time, however, she was accompanied by a second vehicle, a practical-looking pickup truck that discharged a man in his 40s, carrying what appeared to be professional camera equipment. "Jake, good to see you again," Kat said as she approached the porch, extending her hand with the same confident gesture he remembered from their first meeting. Today she was dressed in what Jake was beginning to recognize as her professional uniform. Expensive, but practical clothing that suggested someone comfortable in both boardrooms and farm fields. "Ms. Morrison, thanks for coming out," Jake replied, noting that her handshake was just as firm as he'd remembered. "I have to admit, I'm curious about what you might have in mind for a place like this." "That's exactly what I'm hoping to discuss," Kat said, gesturing toward her companion. "This is Marcus Chen, my development photographer. I hope you don't mind that I brought him along if we decide to move forward with any kind of partnership. We'll need professional documentation of your operation." Marcus Chen was Asian American, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of easy confidence that suggested extensive experience working with agricultural clients. His handshake was firm, and his greeting was warm without being overly familiar. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sullivan," Marcus said. "Kat's told me a lot about your operation. I specialize in agricultural photography, particularly heritage farming operations. I've worked with most of Morrison Land and Development's partner farms over the past few years." The mention of partner farms suggested that Kat Morrison's interest in Sullivan Orchards was more serious than Jake had dared to hope, but it also raised questions about what kind of partnership she had in mind and what it might cost him in terms of independence and control over his family's operation. "Why don't we start with a tour of the property?" Kat suggested. "I'd like to see your orchard, learn about your growing practices, and get a better sense of what you're working with here." Jake led them through the farmhouse first, explaining the history of the Victorian-era structure and pointing out original features that had been preserved through for generations of Sullivan ownership. Kat asked intelligent questions about the house's construction, the property's water rights, and the orchard's infrastructure, while Marcus took careful photographs of both architectural details and the views from various windows. "The house has good bones," Kat observed as they moved from the kitchen to the back porch. "Victorian farmhouses from this era were built to last, and this one's been well maintained despite its age. My great-grandmother was particular about upkeep," Jake replied. "She used to say that a house was like a good peach tree. Take care of it properly, and it'll take care of you for generations." Kat smiled at the analogy. "Sounds like wisdom that applies to more than just houses." They moved outside to begin the orchard tour, and Jake found himself seeing his property through fresh eyes as he explained the layout of his peach groves. The storm damage was obvious: fallen branches, scattered fruit, and standing water in low-lying areas. But Kat seemed more interested in the underlying infrastructure and the health of the trees themselves. "These are genuine Alberta varieties?" she asked, examining a tree that had survived both the spring frost and the recent flooding. "Planted by my great-grandfather in 1925, Jake confirmed. Same rootstock that won the Georgia Peach Festival Grand Prize in 1967, 1974, and 1988. We've got documentation going back to the original planting, including records of which trees were propagated from which parent stock. Kat's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. That's exactly the kind of provenance that makes heritage varieties valuable in today's market. Do you still have trees from the original 1898 planting? Jake led her to a section of the orchard where a dozen ancient trees stood like patriarchs among their younger descendants. These trees were massive by peach tree standards, their trunks gnarled and twisted by decades of weather, but still producing fruit with a complexity of flavor that modern commercial varieties couldn't match. 6 trees from the original planting. Jake said with obvious pride, "My great-grandfather called them his foundation stock. They're not as productive as they used to be, but the fruit they do produce is still the best on the property." Marcus Chen was taking extensive photographs of the heritage trees, capturing both their majestic appearance and the details of their fruit. Kat, meanwhile, was examining the peaches with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "The flavor profile is remarkable," she said after tasting several varieties, complex, balanced, with that distinctive Alberta sweetness. This is what people mean when they talk about real peaches, fruit that actually tastes like something instead of just sugar and water. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Jake found himself relaxing for the first time since she'd arrived. Whatever Kat Morrison's agenda might be, her appreciation for his family's agricultural heritage seemed genuine. "The question," Kat continued, "is whether there's a market for this kind of quality, and whether that market can generate enough revenue to make heritage production economically viable." "And is there?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Absolutely," Kat replied without hesitation. "The market for authentic heritage fruit is growing faster than anyone anticipated. Restaurants are paying premium prices for ingredients with real flavor and verified provenance. Direct consumer sales through farmers markets and online platforms are generating revenues that make wholesale prices look like pocket change, and agritourism, bringing people to the farm to experience heritage agriculture firsthand, can generate additional income streams that most traditional operations never consider." They spent the next 2 hours touring every section of the property, with Kat asking detailed questions about everything from soil composition to pest management practices. Marcus documented the tour with professional thoroughness, creating what amounted to a visual inventory of Sullivan Orchards' assets and potential. As they walked, Kat explained more about Morrison Land and Development's approach to heritage agriculture partnerships. The company provided technical support, marketing assistance, and access to premium markets, while participating farms maintained ownership and operational control. Partners received guaranteed purchase contracts for heritage varieties at prices significantly above conventional wholesale rates, along with support for developing direct sales channels and agritourism opportunities. "It's not charity," Kat emphasized as they returned to the farmhouse as the afternoon sun began to slant through the peach trees. "It's a business partnership based on mutual benefit. We need authentic heritage operations to supply our markets, and farms like yours need access to those markets to remain economically viable." By the time they settled on the front porch with glasses of sweet tea, Jake felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. Kat Morrison's Heritage Fruit Initiative sounded like exactly what Sullivan Orchards needed, and her obvious expertise suggested that the program had the potential to actually work. But he'd learned not to get his hopes up too quickly. Programs that sounded perfect on paper had a way of revealing hidden complications. Once the details emerged, the conversation on the porch stretched into the early evening, with Kat and Marcus asking increasingly detailed questions about Sullivan Orchards, operations, finances, and future plans. Jake found himself being more candid about his situation than he'd intended, explaining the extent of the storm damage, the reality of his financial struggles, and his fears about losing the family farm. "How bad is the situation, honestly?" Kat asked, her tone shifting from professional to personal. "Because if we're going to discuss partnership possibilities, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Jake hesitated, instinctively reluctant to reveal the full extent of his problems to someone he'd known for less than a week. But something about Kat's direct approach and obvious expertise made him feel that honesty was not only appropriate, but necessary. 3 months behind on mortgage payments, he said finally. 2 more missed payments, and the bank forecloses. This year's crop loss means I probably can't make those payments. Without some kind of miracle, equipment is aging out. Irrigation system needs major repairs, and I've been deferring maintenance on everything except absolute necessities. Kat nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a leather portfolio she'd been carrying throughout the tour. What about insurance coverage for the storm damage? Crop insurance will cover maybe 20% of my losses, Jake replied. Standard. Policy doesn't include flood damage, and I couldn't afford the premium for comprehensive coverage. And if you lose the farm, Marcus asked quietly, what happens then? Jake had been trying not to think about that possibility, but the question forced him to confront realities he'd been avoiding. Bank will probably sell to developers. This area's been seeing a lot of pressure for residential development, especially properties with mountain views like this one. 150 acres this close to the mountains could probably be subdivided into 50 or 60 house lots. The thought of his family's century-old orchard being bulldozed for suburban McMansions made Jake's stomach clench with a mixture of anger and grief. Everything his great-grandfather had built, all the careful cultivation and stewardship that had preserved these heritage varieties through for generations, would disappear under a sea of identical houses and manicured lawns. That can't happen, Kat said with surprising vehemence. Operations like this are irreplaceable. Once the trees are gone and the land is developed, that agricultural heritage is lost forever. Her reaction gave Jake hope, but it also raised questions about her motivations. Why did Kat Morrison care so deeply about preserving his family's orchard? What did she gain from preventing another family farm from succumbing to development pressure? As if reading his thoughts, Kat leaned forward in her chair, fixing Jake with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she was about to share something important. I should probably tell you why I'm really here, she said, glancing at Marcus as if seeking permission to continue. My interest in Sullivan Orchards isn't entirely professional. Jake felt his cautious optimism begin to curdle into suspicion. Here it comes, he thought, the real agenda, the hidden catch, the reason why someone like Kat Morrison had taken such a sudden interest in his struggling operation. My great-grandfather's farm was about 10 miles from here, Kat continued, seemingly unaware of Jake's growing wariness. Morrison Orchards, established in 1891, 700 acres of the finest peach trees in North Georgia. Heritage varieties that had been carefully developed over decades of selective breeding. She paused, looking out over Jake's fields with an expression that suggested she was seeing something other than the present landscape. The farm stayed in our family until 1987, when my grandfather sold it to developers rather than pass it on to my father. Dad was working in agricultural consulting by then, trying to help other farmers avoid the fate that had befallen our family. That's how Morrison Land and Development got started, as a way to preserve agricultural heritage that my grandfather hadn't been able to maintain. The revelation recontextualized everything about Kat's interest in Sullivan Orchards. She wasn't just an agricultural consultant looking for another client. She was someone who understood the emotional weight of potentially losing a family farm, because she'd lived through that loss herself. The Morrison place is a subdivision now, Kat continued, her voice carrying traces of old pain. Peachtree Estates, 67 houses on quarter-acre lots, with names like Orchard View Lane and Heritage Drive that mock what used to be there. Every time I drive past it, I think about what we lost when we let economics override everything my great-grandfather had built. Jake found himself reconsidering every aspect of their interaction. Kat's expertise, her passion for heritage agriculture, her company's focus on preserving family farms. It all made sense if she was trying to prevent other families from experiencing the loss that had shaped her own family's history. So this is personal for you, Jake observed. Everything I do is personal, Kat replied. But that doesn't mean it's not also good business. Heritage agriculture preservation works because it creates value for everyone involved. Farmers get access to premium markets, consumers get access to authentic products, and agricultural heritage gets preserved for future generations. Marcus Chen had been photographing the sunset over the orchard, while Kat shared her family's story, but now he rejoined the conversation with a perspective that suggested he'd heard similar discussions before. Kat's family history gives her motivation, Marcus said, but it's her business acumen that makes the Heritage Fruit Initiative successful. I've documented transformations at a dozen partner farms over the past 3 years, and every one of them has exceeded the original projections for both revenue generation and heritage preservation. The testimonial from someone who'd obviously worked with multiple Morrison land and development projects carried significant weight with Jake. Marcus Chen struck him as someone who'd be unlikely to participate in any kind of deceptive scheme, which suggested that Kat's program had genuine merit beyond emotional appeal. What would partnership with your company actually look like? Jake asked, deciding that directness was the best approach to understanding his options. Kat opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that appeared to be a standard partnership agreement template. This is our basic framework, she said, handing Jake several pages of professionally formatted text. Obviously, any actual agreement would be customized for your specific situation, but this gives you an idea of how we structure these relationships. Jake scanned the document, noting sections that covered everything from heritage variety verification to marketing support to financial arrangements. The terminology was sophisticated but clearly written, suggesting that Morrison Land and Development had extensive experience in agricultural partnerships. The basic concept is straightforward, Kat explained as Jake read. You maintain ownership and operational control of your farm. We provide technical support, market access, and guaranteed purchase contracts for your heritage varieties. You get immediate access to premium markets that can generate revenues significantly above conventional wholesale prices. What's the catch? Jake asked, looking up from the document. Because this sounds too good to be true. Kat smiled at his skepticism. The catch is that it requires significant changes to how you operate. Transitioning to heritage production means lower yields, more labor-intensive cultivation practices, and detailed documentation requirements. You'll need to obtain organic certification, implement sustainable farming practices, and maintain production standards that exceed conventional commercial requirements. She paused, allowing Jake to absorb the implications of what she'd described. Additionally, Kat continued, partnership with Morrison Land and Development includes exclusivity provisions. Once you join our network, you commit to selling your heritage varieties exclusively through our marketing channels. No more wholesale to grocery chains or fruit distributors. Jake felt his optimism waver as he considered the magnitude of the changes Kat was describing. Transitioning to heritage production would essentially mean rebuilding his entire operation from the ground up, abandoning cultivation practices that his family had used for decades in favor of methods he'd never attempted. How long does the transition take? He asked. 2 to 3 years for full conversion, Marcus replied. But revenue improvements usually begin within the first year, as you start selling directly to restaurants and through farmers markets. And what happens if it doesn't work? Jake pressed. If the market doesn't develop as projected, or if I can't make the operational changes necessary for success? Kat's expression grew more serious. That's a fair question, and the honest answer is that there are no guarantees. Agricultural partnerships always involve risk, regardless of how carefully they're structured. But I can tell you that in 3 years of operating the Heritage Fruit Initiative, we haven't had a single partner farm fail to meet our revenue projections. The statistics were encouraging, but Jake found himself thinking about the timing of Kat's offer in the context of his immediate financial crisis. Even if the Heritage Fruit Initiative could transform Sullivan Orchards into a profitable operation over the next few years, he needed solutions that would address his current mortgage problems within the next few months. I appreciate the opportunity, Jake said carefully, but I'm not sure I can afford to wait 2 or 3 years for results. My bank situation is more immediate than that. Kat nodded as if she'd been expecting this concern. Which brings us to the other component of what I'd like to propose, she said, reaching for another document in her portfolio. Immediate capital investment to address your current financial crisis. Jake felt his pulse quicken as Kat placed a second agreement on the table between them. This document was shorter than the partnership framework, but the numbers he could see in the financial sections made his eyes widen. Morrison Land and Development is prepared to provide immediate financial assistance to cover your current mortgage arrears and provide working capital. For the first year of operational transition, Kat explained, this wouldn't be a loan, it would be an investment in exchange for partnership equity. The offer was simultaneously exactly what Jake needed and potentially too good to be true. Someone offering to solve his immediate financial problems, while providing a path toward long-term prosperity sounded like every farmer's fantasy, which made Jake deeply suspicious about what the real cost might be. What kind of equity are we talking about? He asked, studying Kat's face for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. 20% partnership interest in Sullivan Orchards, Kat replied without hesitation. You retain majority ownership and operational control, but Morrison Land and Development becomes a minority partner with shared interest in the farm's success. Jake set down the documents and leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Kat was proposing. Partnership with Morrison Land and Development could solve his immediate financial crisis while providing a clear path toward long-term prosperity. But it would also mean giving up a portion of his family's farm to someone he'd known for less than a week. This is a lot to process, Jake said finally. I'm going to need time to think about it, probably discuss it with my sister, maybe consult with an attorney who understands agricultural partnerships. Of course, Kat agreed readily. Decisions this important shouldn't be made hastily. Take whatever time you need to research our company, review the terms, and make sure you understand exactly what we're proposing. As Kat and Marcus packed up their materials and prepared to leave, Jake found himself studying Kat Morrison with new appreciation for the complexity of her motivations. She was simultaneously a successful businesswoman pursuing profitable opportunities and someone driven by personal mission to preserve agricultural heritage that her own family had lost. One more question, Jake said as they reached Kat's Tesla. Why Sullivan Orchards specifically? I'm sure there are other heritage operations that might be better candidates for partnership. Kat paused with her hand on the car door, considering her response carefully. Honestly, because when I researched your family's history and saw what you've preserved here, it reminded me of what my great-grandfather built before we lost it. Sullivan Orchards represents the kind of agricultural heritage that Morrison Land and Development exists to protect. If we can help you succeed here, it proves that heritage agriculture can thrive even when everything seems stacked against it. She slipped into the driver's seat but rolled down the window before starting the engine. Jake, I know this feels overwhelming, and I know you have good reasons to be skeptical, but I also know that operations like yours don't survive without help, and families like mine don't get second chances to preserve what our ancestors built. This partnership could benefit everyone involved, but only if you're willing to take the risk. As the Tesla disappeared down the gravel driveway, Jake stood in the gathering darkness, holding documents that could either save his family's farm or cost him the independence that for generations of Sullivans had fought to maintain. The next 3 days passed in a blur of research, phone calls, and sleepless nights as Jake tried to process the magnitude of Kat Morrison's proposal. Emma had driven up from Athens immediately after Jake called to explain the situation, and she'd spent 2 days helping him research Morrison Land and Development's track record and analyze the partnership documents Kat had provided. The more they learned about Kat's company, the more impressed they became. Morrison Land and Development had an impeccable reputation in agricultural circles, with a track record of successful partnerships that had transformed struggling farms into profitable heritage operations. Independent verification from agricultural extension agents, university researchers, and partner farmers themselves confirmed that Kat's programs delivered the results she promised. But impressive credentials didn't eliminate the fundamental risk involved in giving up 20% ownership of their family farm. To someone they'd known for less than a week, Emma had consulted with two of her agricultural business professors at UGA, both of whom confirmed that the partnership terms were unusually favorable for the farm owner while still providing adequate protections for the investor. It's a good deal, Emma had concluded after reviewing all the documentation, maybe to good, which makes me wonder what we're missing. Jake had spent Sunday morning walking every row of his orchard, trying to imagine what the property might look like under Cat Morrison's Heritage Agriculture Program. The changes would be substantial: organic certification, sustainable farming practices, direct marketing channels that would require skills he'd never developed. But the potential rewards were equally substantial: guaranteed premium prices, access to markets that paid for quality rather than quantity, and enough revenue to not only save the farm but expand it. By Sunday evening, Jake had made his decision. The risk of partnership with Morrison Land and Development was significant, but the risk of doing nothing was certain failure. Cat Morrison might be offering an opportunity that was too good to be true, but she was also offering the only realistic path towards saving Sullivan Orchards that he'd seen in months of searching for alternatives. Monday morning, Jake called Cat's direct number and left a message asking to meet again to discuss partnership terms in more detail. She returned his call within an hour, suggesting that they meet Tuesday afternoon at his farm to review specific implementation plans and finalize contract language. "I'm glad you're interested in moving forward," Cat said, her voice carrying obvious satisfaction. "I've been working on some preliminary plans for Sullivan Orchards that I think you'll find exciting." Tuesday afternoon arrived with the kind of perfect late summer weather that made North Georgia famous among tourists and agricultural photographers. Cat Morrison arrived precisely on time, accompanied not only by Marcus Chen, but also by a woman introduced as Dr. Sarah Kim, Morrison Land and Development's head of agricultural operations. Dr. Kim was Korean-American, probably in her late 30s, with the kind of confident competence that suggested extensive experience in agricultural science. Her handshake was firm, and her greeting was professional but warm. "I've been looking forward to meeting you, Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Kim said. "Cat's told me wonderful things about your heritage, varieties, and your family's commitment to quality agriculture." They settled on the front porch with folders full of documentation that Cat had prepared. Since their previous meeting, the materials were extensive and professionally prepared, suggesting that Morrison Land and Development had devoted significant resources to developing a partnership plan specific to Sullivan Orchards. "Before we discuss implementation details," Cat began, "I want to make sure you understand exactly what we're proposing and what it would mean for your operation." She opened her folder and withdrew a document titled Sullivan Orchards Heritage Agriculture Development Plan. The plan was beautifully formatted with professional graphics, photographs of heritage peach varieties, and detailed projections for everything from crop yields to revenue generation. "The basic concept," Cat explained, "is to transform Sullivan Orchards into a showcase heritage operation that demonstrates the economic viability of traditional agriculture in a modern market context." She walked Jake through the plan section by section, explaining how his current operation would be modified to emphasize heritage variety production, organic farming practices, and direct marketing channels. The changes were substantial but carefully planned, with implementation schedules that minimize disruption to existing operations while gradually introducing new practices and market channels. Phase 1 involves organic certification and infrastructure improvements, Dr. Kim explained. Taking over the presentation, "We'll upgrade your irrigation system, implement integrated pest management protocols, and begin transitioning your soil management practices to organic standards." Phase 2 focuses on market development, Marcus added. "We'll establish direct relationships with high-end restaurants in Atlanta, develop your farmers' market presence, and create online sales platforms for direct consumer marketing." Phase 3 involves agritourism development, Cat continued. "Farm tours, pick your own operations, educational workshops, and special events that bring people to Sullivan Orchards to experience heritage agriculture firsthand." The scope of The transformation Kat was proposing exceeded anything Jake had imagined. When he'd first called her number, she wasn't just offering to help him market his peaches differently. She was proposing to turn Sullivan Orchards into a destination that would attract visitors from across the region while serving as a model for heritage agriculture development. "This is much more ambitious than I expected," Jake said, studying the detailed implementation timeline that showed activities extending over the next 5 years. "Ambitious projects require ambitious vision," Kat replied, "but they also generate ambitious results. Our projections show Sullivan Orchards generating 3 times your current revenue within 4 years, with potential for continued expansion as the heritage agriculture market develops." Jake reviewed the financial projections, which showed not only substantial revenue increases, but also detailed breakdowns of how those revenues would be generated: restaurant sales, farmers market income, online direct sales, agritourism activities, and educational workshop fees were all projected to contribute to a diversified revenue stream that would insulate the farm from the boom and bust cycles that had plagued conventional agriculture. "The numbers look impressive," Jake said, "but they also assume a lot of things going right. What if restaurants don't want to pay premium prices for heritage peaches? What if tourists don't want to visit North Georgia farms? What if the online market doesn't develop as projected?" Dr. Kim leaned forward, her expression serious but confident. "Those are excellent questions, and they're exactly the kind of concerns we address through careful market research and conservative projections. Every number in these documents is based on actual performance data from similar operations." She opened her own folder and withdrew a thick document labeled Heritage Agriculture Market Analysis. "Southeast Region. We've been tracking heritage fruit markets for 3 years." Dr. Kim continued. "Demand consistently exceeds supply, prices continue to increase, and consumer interest in authentic agricultural experiences shows no signs of declining. If anything, our projections err on the side of caution." Marcus Chen contributed his own perspective based on extensive experience documenting heritage agriculture operations throughout the region. "I've photographed dozens of farms that have made similar transitions," he said. "The successful ones all share certain characteristics: genuine heritage credentials, commitment to quality, and willingness to embrace new marketing approaches. Sullivan Orchards has all 3." As the afternoon progressed, Jake found his initial skepticism giving way to cautious excitement. The Morrison land and development team had clearly done their homework, and their projections were based on solid market research rather than wishful thinking. More importantly, they understood that successful heritage agriculture required not just good farming, but also sophisticated marketing and business development skills. "Assuming I decide to move forward," Jake said, "what happens next?" Kat smiled, suggesting she'd been expecting this question. "We finalize partnership agreements, begin immediate infrastructure improvements, and start the organic certification process. You'll also begin working with our marketing team to develop your brand identity and establish relationships with potential customers." "And the financial component?" Jake asked, referring to the immediate capital investment that would address his current mortgage crisis. "Funds would be available within 2 weeks of signed agreements," Kat replied. "Enough to bring your mortgage current, cover operational expenses for the transition period, and begin infrastructure improvements." The offer was exactly what Jake needed to hear, but it also represented a point of no return. Once he accepted Morrison Land and Development's investment and began implementing their heritage agriculture program, there would be no going back to conventional peach farming. "I have one more question," Jake said, looking directly at Kat. "What do you personally gain from this partnership? I understand the business rationale, but I also sense that your motivations go beyond profit margins." Kat was quiet for a moment, looking out over the orchard, with an expression that suggested she was seeing beyond the present landscape to something that existed only in her imagination. "I gain the satisfaction of knowing that another generation of heritage agriculture will survive when it might otherwise be lost," she said finally. "My great-grandfather would be proud to know that his work continues, even if it's not on the land he originally farmed." The personal dimension of Kat's motivation resonated with Jake in ways that pure business considerations could not. He understood the weight of generational responsibility, the sense of obligation to preserve what previous generations had built, and the fear of being the one who let it all disappear. "How much time do I have to make a final decision?" Jake asked. "Take whatever time you need," Kat replied. "But I should mention that we're beginning our fall planning cycle, and Sullivan Orchards would need to be confirmed as a partner by the end of September to begin implementation in time for next year's growing season." The deadline was less than 3 weeks away, but Jake realized he'd already made his decision. The risks were real, but the alternative was certain failure. Kat Morrison was offering him a chance to save his family's farm while transforming it into something that honored the past while embracing the future. "I don't need 3 weeks," Jake said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "If you're willing to work with Sullivan Orchards, then I'm willing to work with Morrison Land and Development." Kat's smile was radiant as she extended her hand for a handshake that would change the trajectory of both their lives. "Welcome to the Heritage Fruit Initiative, Jake Sullivan. I think we're going to accomplish something remarkable together." As they shook hands on the front porch of the farmhouse that had sheltered for generations of Sullivans, Jake felt a mixture of relief, excitement, and terror that reminded him of jumping off the rope swing into Miller's Creek when he was 12 years old. The decision was made, the partnership was sealed, and his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Dr. Kim and Marcus began discussing implementation timelines and next steps, but Jake found himself studying Kat Morrison's face and wondering what he'd just committed himself to. She had saved his farm from certain foreclosure, but she'd also fundamentally altered the trajectory of his family's agricultural legacy. Whether that change would prove to be salvation or something else entirely remained to be seen. "There's one more thing I should mention," Kat said as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the orchard. "Morrison Land and Development has been working on a documentary project about heritage agriculture in the Southeast. We'd like Sullivan Orchards to be featured as one of our case studies. If you're comfortable with that level of publicity." Jake considered the implications of having his farm featured in a documentary. On one hand, the exposure could be valuable for marketing his heritage pizzas and attracting agritourism visitors. On the other hand, he'd always valued the privacy and independence that came with running a small family operation. "What would that involve?" he asked. Marcus Chen answered, his expertise in agricultural photography making him the logical person to explain the documentary component. "We'd document the transformation process over the next 2 years, showing how heritage agriculture partnerships work in practice, nothing too intrusive, periodic filming sessions, interviews about your experience, maybe some historical background about your family's farming legacy. The documentary is optional," Kat added quickly. "Your partnership with Morrison Land and Development doesn't depend on media participation, but we've found that farms featured in our educational materials tend to attract more visitors and generate more direct sales opportunities." Jake thought about his grandfather, who had always been proud of Sullivan Orchard's reputation, but had never sought publicity for its own sake. Samuel would probably have been amused by the idea of his grandson becoming the subject of a documentary about heritage agriculture, but he also would have understood the practical benefits that media exposure could provide. "Let me think about the documentary," Jake said. "The partnership itself is what matters most right now." As Kat, Dr. Kim, and Marcus packed up their materials and prepared to leave, Jake felt the weight of the decision he'd just made settling over him like a familiar jacket. He'd committed Sullivan Orchards to a transformation that would affect every aspect of the farm's operation, but he'd also secured the resources necessary to preserve his family's agricultural legacy for future generations. "We'll have contracts ready for your review within 48 hours, Kat said as they reached her Tesla. "Once the legal paperwork is finalized, we can begin immediately with infrastructure assessments and organic certification applications." "How quickly will I see results?" Jake asked, thinking about his mortgage payments and the other financial obligations that had been keeping him awake at night. "Restaurant contracts typically take 6 to 8 weeks to finalize," Dr. Kim replied. Farmers market sales can begin almost immediately once you have product to sell. Online direct sales require some setup time, but they usually generate revenue within the first month of operation. The timeline she described would get Jake through his immediate financial crisis while providing a foundation for long-term prosperity. For the first time in months, he could envision a future for Sullivan Orchards that didn't involve foreclosure notices and bankruptcy attorneys. As the Morrison land and development team drove away, Jake stood on his front porch watching the sun set over his peach trees and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. 3 days ago, he'd been a struggling farmer facing certain failure. Now he was a partner in what Cat Morrison had described as the most ambitious heritage agriculture project in North Georgia. The transformation wouldn't be easy. Organic certification alone would require changes to virtually every aspect of his farming practices, and developing direct marketing channels would demand skills he'd never needed as a wholesale producer. But Jake found himself looking forward to the challenges rather than dreading them. For the first time since his grandfather's death, he had a clear vision of what Sullivan Orchards could become. Emma called that evening, eager to hear about the meeting and Jake's decision. He spent nearly an hour explaining the partnership terms, the implementation timeline, and the potential for documenting the transformation process. "It sounds incredible," Emma said, her excitement evident even over the phone. "This could change everything for us, Jake, not just financially, but in terms of what the farm represents and what we can accomplish here." "I know," Jake replied, feeling a mixture of anticipation and responsibility that reminded him of the day his grandfather had first shown him how to prune peach trees. "I just hope I'm making the right choice. Grandfather always said that the biggest risk was not taking any risks," Emma reminded him. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You lose the farm? You were going to lose it anyway if you didn't do something." Her practical assessment helped settle Jake's remaining doubts. Cat Morrison's partnership offer represented a calculated risk with significant potential upside, while doing nothing represented certain failure. When viewed in that context, the choice was obvious. 2 days later, Jake sat at his kitchen table reviewing partnership contracts that would formalize his relationship with Morrison Land and Development. The documents were comprehensive but clearly written, covering everything from organic certification requirements to revenue sharing arrangements to quality control standards. The financial terms were even more favorable than Cat had initially indicated. Morrison Land and Development would provide immediate capital investment, sufficient to bring his mortgage current and fund operational improvements, in exchange for 20% partnership equity and exclusive marketing rights for his heritage varieties. Jake would retain majority ownership and operational control while gaining access to premium markets that could transform Sullivan Orchards from a struggling operation into a profitable showcase for heritage agriculture. As Jake signed his name to the partnership agreements, he thought about his great-grandfather, who had planted the first peach trees on Sullivan land in 1898. The old man had taken a similar leap of faith, investing everything he had in the belief that North Georgia's soil and climate could produce peaches worthy of national recognition. Now, 125 years later, his great-grandson was taking another leap of faith, betting that heritage agriculture could preserve the family legacy while adapting to the realities of modern markets. The contracts were scheduled to be picked up the following morning by Dr. Kim, who would begin immediate implementation of the heritage agriculture transition plan. Within a week, Sullivan Orchards would begin the process of transformation that Cat Morrison had promised would serve as a model for heritage farming throughout the Southeast. As Jake sealed the signed contracts in the envelope provided by Morrison Land and Development, he felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for months. The decision was made, the partnership was formalized, and Sullivan Orchards was embarking on a new chapter that honored its past while embracing its future. Outside, the ancient peach trees stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky that had witnessed more than a century of Sullivan family farming. Tomorrow, those trees would begin their transformation from conventional commercial producers to heritage variety showcases. But tonight they were simply what they had always been, living links between past and future, rooted in soil that had supported for generations of dreams and determination. Jake turned off the kitchen lights and headed upstairs, leaving the contracts on the table where Dr. Kim would find them in the morning. As he climbed the stairs his grandfather had climbed thousands of times before him, Jake felt the weight of generational responsibility settling into something that felt more like opportunity than burden. The struggling farmer who had pulled a stranger's car from the mud was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the future of family farming might depend on having the courage to embrace change while preserving what matters most. 3 weeks after signing the partnership agreements with Morrison Land and Development, Jake found himself standing in the renovated barn that now served as Sullivan Orchards processing and packaging facility, watching Emma operate equipment that would have been unimaginable on the property just a month earlier. The transformation had begun with shocking speed and efficiency that validated every promise Cat Morrison had made during their initial negotiations. Dr. Sarah Kim had arrived the morning after the contracts were signed, accompanied by a team of agricultural specialists, organic certification experts, and infrastructure engineers who immediately began implementing the heritage agriculture transition plan. The first phase had focused on urgent improvements, upgrading the irrigation system, implementing organic soil management protocols, and establishing the documentation systems required for organic certification. But it was the arrival of Frank Morrison, Kat's cousin and head of Morrison Land and Development's partner farm network, that had really convinced Jake he'd made the right decision. Frank had spent 2 days at Sullivan Orchards, sharing detailed case studies from 12 other heritage agriculture operations that had successfully completed similar transitions. The first year is always the hardest, Frank had explained as they walked through the orchard, examining the century-old Alberta trees that would serve as the centerpiece of Sullivan Orchard's heritage fruit program. You're learning new methods, adapting to organic practices, and building market relationships all at the same time. But by year 2, most of our partner farms report that they can't imagine going back to conventional agriculture. Frank had brought photo documentation from other Morrison Land and Development projects, before and after comparisons, that showed struggling farms transformed into thriving heritage operations. The Williamson Apple Orchard in North Carolina had increased revenue by 340% in 3 years. The Peach Valley Farm in South Carolina had gone from near bankruptcy to supplying premium restaurants throughout the Southeast. The Mountain View Berry Farm in Virginia had developed such a successful agritourism program that they were booked solid through the following summer. Every situation is different, Frank had continued, but the pattern is consistent. Heritage agriculture works because it creates value that conventional farming can't match: premium prices, direct customer relationships, and diversified revenue streams that protect you from market fluctuations. The validation had extended beyond Morrison Land and Development's internal success stories. Emma had arranged for Jake to speak with Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, an agricultural economist at the University of Georgia who had studied heritage agriculture programs throughout the Southeast. Dr. Rodriguez's research confirmed that heritage fruit operations consistently outperformed conventional farms in both profitability and sustainability metrics. The market fundamentals are sound, Dr. Rodriguez had explained during a lengthy phone conversation. Consumer demand for authentic, locally produced heritage varieties is growing at 15 to 20% annually. Restaurant demand is even stronger, with high-end establishments willing to pay premium prices for ingredients with proven provenance and superior flavor profiles. She had also addressed Jake's concerns about the exclusivity provisions in his partnership agreement with Morrison Land and Development. Exclusive marketing relationships can be restrictive, she'd acknowledged, but they also provide guaranteed market access that most small farms never achieve. Morrison's track record suggests they're committed to their partner's success, not just their own profit margins. The external validation had been reinforced by visits from neighboring farmers who had heard about Sullivan Orchards' partnership with Morrison Land and Development. The response had been universally positive, with several expressing interest in learning more about heritage agriculture programs. For their own operations, Tom Bradley, who operated an apple orchard 2 counties over, had spent an entire afternoon discussing the transition process with Jake. "I've been watching Morrison's projects for a couple years," Tom had said. "Every farm they partner with seems to turn around within 18 months. Word in the agricultural community is that Cat Morrison knows what she's doing." The most meaningful validation had come from an unexpected source, Martha Henderson from First National Bank, who had called Jake personally to discuss his changed financial situation. Morrison Land and Development's immediate capital investment had not only brought his mortgage current, but had established a substantial operating account that demonstrated the farm's improved viability. "I have to admit, Jake, I wasn't sure what to make of this partnership when you first mentioned it," Martha had said. "But the financial projections your new partners provided are the most detailed and conservative I've seen for any agricultural development project in this region. Whatever they're doing, it appears to be working." The conversation with Martha had marked a psychological turning point for Jake. For the first time in years, his banker was calling to discuss opportunities rather than problems. The weight of financial stress that had dominated his daily life for months had been replaced by cautious optimism about Sullivan Orchards' future. But perhaps the most significant validation had come from an unexpected visit by Samuel Richardson, an 87-year-old retired peach farmer whose family had operated one of North Georgia's most respected heritage orchards until the 1990s. Richardson had heard about Sullivan Orchards' partnership through the agricultural community and had driven over specifically to see what Morrison Land and Development was accomplishing. "Your great-grandfather and my grandfather were friends," Richardson had told Jake as they examined the ancient Alberta trees. "They used to share rootstock and compare notes about growing methods. Samuel would be proud to see these trees getting the attention they deserve." Richardson had spent 2 hours touring the property, sharing stories about traditional peach cultivation methods and offering insights about heritage variety management that couldn't be found in any textbook. His approval of the Morrison Land and Development approach had meant more to Jake than any professional endorsement. "Cat Morrison understands something that a lot of agricultural consultants miss," Richardson had observed. "Heritage farming isn't about going backward. It's about moving forward while preserving the best of what came before. These old varieties have value that goes beyond money, but they also need to generate income if they're going to survive." By the end of September, Jake felt confident that his partnership with Morrison Land and Development was built on solid foundations rather than wishful thinking. The validation had come from multiple sources: successful case studies, academic research, peer farmer experiences, financial analysis, and the wisdom of agricultural elders who understood both the challenges and opportunities of heritage farming. Emma had returned to Athens for the fall semester, but not before helping Jake establish the documentation systems that would track every aspect of the heritage agriculture transition. Her agricultural business coursework had provided valuable context for understanding the complexity of what they were attempting, and her enthusiasm for the project had given Jake additional confidence in his decision. "This is exactly the kind of innovation that will keep family farms competitive," Emma had said during her last weekend at the farm before classes resumed. "You're not just saving Sullivan Orchards, you're pioneering a model that other farms can follow." As October arrived with its spectacular display of autumn colors across the North Georgia mountains, Jake stood in his renovated barn, surrounded by equipment that represented the cutting edge of small-scale agricultural processing, preparing for the next phase of Sullivan Orchards' transformation. The validation period was complete, and the real work of building a heritage agriculture showcase was about to begin. Beat 9. The transformation process. The first harvest under the Morrison Land and Development partnership took place during the second week of October, when the last of Sullivan Orchards' Alberta peaches reached perfect ripeness. Jake had experienced dozens of harvests throughout his life, but this one felt fundamentally different from anything that had come before. instead of rushing to pick fruit as quickly as possible for wholesale markets that paid commodity prices. He found himself carefully selecting individual peaches based on flavor, appearance, and the specific requirements of premium customers who valued quality over quantity. Cat Morrison had arrived at dawn on harvest day, accompanied by Marcus Chen and a small crew of harvest specialists who understood the meticulous standards required for heritage fruit production. The difference in approach was immediately apparent. Where conventional harvesting emphasized speed and volume, heritage harvesting prioritized careful handling and precise selection. Each peach needs to meet restaurant standards, explained Maria Santos, Morrison Land and Development's head of harvest operations. Premium customers expect consistent size, perfect appearance, and optimal ripeness. We're not just picking fruit, we're curating an experience. The harvest crew worked in teams of 2, with one person selecting fruit and another carefully placing each peach in specially designed containers that prevented bruising during transport. Every container was labeled with harvest date, tree location, and ripeness level, creating a tracking system that would allow Morrison Land and Development's marketing team to match specific fruit characteristics with customer preferences. Jake worked alongside the harvest crew, learning techniques he'd never needed during his years of conventional farming. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Peaches were evaluated for color uniformity, surface texture, stem end appearance, and firmness level. Fruit that would have been perfectly acceptable for wholesale markets was set aside for secondary uses if it didn't meet the exacting standards required for restaurant sales. It's a completely different mindset, Cat observed as they worked together to harvest from one of the century-old foundation trees. Conventional agriculture treats fruit as a commodity. Maximize volume, minimize cost, compete on price. Heritage agriculture treats fruit as a craft product. Maximize quality, justify premium pricing, compete on uniqueness. The harvest yielded approximately 3,000 pounds of premium-grade Alberta peaches, significantly less than what the same trees would have produced under conventional management, but worth substantially more per pound than anything Jake had ever grown. Morrison Land and Development's restaurant customers had contracted for the entire harvest at prices that averaged $8 per pound, compared to the 75 cents per pound that wholesale markets typically paid for conventional peaches. The math is simple, Dr. Kim explained as they processed the harvest data. Lower yields at dramatically higher prices generate more revenue than high yields at commodity prices. Plus, heritage production is more sustainable environmentally and economically. The financial impact was immediate and dramatic. Sullivan Orchards' first heritage harvest generated more revenue in 2 weeks than Jake's best conventional season had produced in an entire year. The premium pricing allowed him to not only cover all operational expenses, but also begin investing in additional infrastructure improvements that would support expanded heritage production. But the transformation extended far beyond financial considerations. Jake found himself developing relationships with customers who valued his expertise and appreciated the story behind his heritage varieties. Chef Amanda Davis from Atlanta's renowned farm-to-table restaurant Harvest had driven to Sullivan Orchards personally to meet Jake and learn about the history of his Alberta peaches. "These are exactly what I've been looking for," Chef Davis had said after tasting fruit from the century-old foundation trees. "Complex flavor, perfect texture, and a story that my customers will connect with. I'd like to feature Sullivan Orchards peaches as a signature ingredient on our fall menu." The relationship with Chef Davis had led to similar connections with other high-end restaurants throughout the Southeast. Within a month of the harvest, Sullivan Orchards had established ongoing supply relationships with 12 restaurants, 3 specialty food retailers, and a growing number of individual customers who had discovered the superior quality of heritage peaches through farmers market sales. The farmers market experience had been particularly rewarding for Jake, who had never sold directly to consumers. During his years of wholesale farming, Morrison Land and Development had provided extensive training in direct marketing techniques, helping him develop the communication skills necessary to explain the value of heritage varieties to customers. Accustomed to conventional supermarket fruit, the story is as important as the product, Marcus Chen had explained during Jake's first farmers market appearance. People aren't just buying peaches, they're buying a connection to agricultural heritage, family tradition, and authentic flavor that they can't find anywhere else. Jake's farmers market booth had become one of the most popular destinations. At both the Elijah Farmers Market and the larger regional market in Blue Ridge, customers would often spend 10 or 15 minutes learning about the history of Sullivan Orchards, the characteristics of different Alberta varieties, and the principles of heritage agriculture before making their purchases. It's educational as much as commercial, Jake had explained to Emma during one of their weekly phone calls. People are genuinely interested in understanding what makes heritage fruit different from what they find in grocery stores. They're willing to pay premium prices because they understand the value they're receiving. The educational component had led to additional revenue opportunities through farm tours and workshops that Morrison Land and Development had helped Jake develop. October weekends brought a steady stream of visitors who wanted to see heritage agriculture in practice and learn about traditional farming methods. The farm tours had proven especially popular with families, school groups, and agricultural enthusiasts who appreciated the opportunity to experience working farm operations firsthand. Jake had initially been nervous about leading tours, but he'd discovered that his genuine passion for heritage agriculture and deep knowledge of peach cultivation made him a natural educator. There's something powerful about seeing where your food actually comes from, observed Dr. Lisa Chen, a pediatrician from Atlanta who had brought her family for a tour. My kids have never understood that fruit grows on trees until today. This kind of agricultural education is invaluable. The success of the farm tours had led Morrison Land and Development to propose expanding Sullivan Orchards agritourism offerings to include seasonal festivals, harvest workshops, and specialized programs for agricultural students. The potential revenue from agritourism activities could eventually match or exceed income from fruit sales, creating a diversified business model that would insulate the farm from weather-related crop losses. November brought the beginning of dormant season activities that would prepare Sullivan Orchards for its first full year as a heritage agriculture operation. Jake worked with Dr. Kim and her team to implement soil improvement programs, pruning protocols, and pest management systems that would support organic certification while maximizing the health and productivity of his heritage trees. This is when the real transformation happens, Dr. Kim explained as they developed detailed management plans for each section of the orchard. The harvest season shows what heritage agriculture can accomplish, but the dormant season work determines what next year's harvest will look like. The winter months also provided time for Jake to attend agricultural conferences and workshops that expanded his understanding of heritage farming techniques. Morrison Land and Development sponsored his participation in the Southeast Heritage Agriculture Conference, where he met other farmers who were implementing similar programs and learned about innovations in organic production methods. The learning curve is steep, Jake had admitted to Kat during one of her regular visits to monitor the partnership's progress. But it's also exciting. I'm using skills and knowledge that I never needed as a conventional farmer. That's exactly what we hoped would happen, Kat replied. Heritage agriculture isn't just about preserving old varieties. It's about developing new expertise that makes traditional farming economically viable in modern markets. By December, Jake felt like he was operating a fundamentally different business than the one he'd inherited from his grandfather. Sullivan Orchards was still a family peach farm, but it was also an educational destination, a supplier to premium restaurants, a conservation showcase for heritage varieties, and a model for sustainable agriculture practices. The transformation had required learning new skills, adapting to unfamiliar standards, and developing comfort levels with publicity and customer interaction that had initially felt foreign. But the results spoke for themselves: financial stability, environmental sustainability, and the preservation of agricultural heritage that had seemed destined for extinction. Just months earlier, as winter deepened into the new year, Jake found himself reflecting on how completely his life had changed since that rainy afternoon when he'd pulled Cat Morrison's Tesla out of the mud. The transformation went far beyond Sullivan Orchards' conversion to heritage agriculture. It encompassed fundamental changes in how he saw himself, his role in the agricultural community, and his relationship with the legacy his family had built over for generations. The most obvious change was financial. Jake's bank statements told a story of dramatic transformation from negative cash flow and mounting debt to positive margins and growing reserves. But the psychological impact of financial security went deeper than numbers on a page. For the first time since his grandfather's death, Jake could make decisions based on what was best for the farm's long-term health, rather than what was necessary for short-term survival. "You seem different," Emma observed during her winter break visit home. "More confident, more engaged with what you're doing, less like you're fighting a losing battle every day." Jake recognized the truth in his sister's assessment. The constant stress of potential foreclosure had been replaced by enthusiasm for projects that would enhance Sullivan Orchards' reputation as a heritage agriculture showcase. Instead of deferring maintenance and worrying about equipment failures, he was investing in improvements that would support expanded production and attract more visitors. But the personal evolution extended beyond financial considerations to encompass Jake's growing role as an advocate for heritage agriculture throughout the Southeast. Morrison Land and Development had begun featuring Sullivan Orchards in their educational materials, and Jake found himself regularly invited to speak at agricultural conferences and university workshops. "You've become one of our most effective ambassadors," Kat told him after his presentation at the Georgia Agricultural Conference had drawn an overflow crowd. "When you talk about heritage farming, people understand that it's not just theory. It's practical knowledge from someone who's actually making it work." Jake's speaking engagements had led to consulting opportunities with other farmers who were considering transitions to heritage agriculture. He'd spent weekends visiting operations throughout North Georgia, sharing lessons learned during Sullivan Orchards' transformation, and helping other farmers evaluate whether heritage programs might work for their situations. "There's something satisfying about helping other farmers succeed," Jake explained to Kat during one of their regular planning meetings. "Grandfather always said that farming knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded." The consulting work had also deepened Jake's appreciation for what Morrison Land and Development had accomplished at Sullivan Orchards. Seeing other farms struggle with organic certification, market development, and infrastructure improvements made him realize how comprehensively Kat's team had managed their transition process. "We were incredibly fortunate," Jake admitted. "Most farmers attempting this kind of transition don't have access to the level of support and expertise that Morrison Land and Development provided. It's made me more committed to helping other operations succeed." Jake's evolving relationship with Kat Morrison had been another significant change in his life. What had begun as a business partnership had gradually developed into something more personal, though both had been cautious about mixing professional and romantic considerations. The shift had been gradual and natural, growing out of shared values, mutual respect, and countless hours spent working together on projects that mattered to both of them. Kat's regular visits to Sullivan Orchards had become highlights of Jake's week, opportunities to share successes, discuss challenges, and plan for the farm's continued development. "I appreciate that you've never tried to change what Sullivan Orchards represents," Jake told Kat during a February evening as they walked through the dormant orchard, discussing plans for spring planting. "You've enhanced our family's legacy without erasing it. That was always the goal," Kat replied. "The best partnerships preserve what's valuable while adding new capabilities. I think we've accomplished that here." Their growing personal relationship had been tested by the demands of managing both Sullivan Orchards' heritage agriculture program and Morrison Land and Development's expanding network of partner farms. Kat's responsibilities required frequent travel, and Jake's commitment to the farm limited his availability for extended trips. But rather than creating conflicts, the shared dedication to agricultural preservation had strengthened their bond. Both understood the demands of farming, the importance of seasonal schedules, and the satisfaction that came from preserving heritage varieties that might otherwise be lost. We're building something together that's larger than either of our individual efforts, Cat observed. Sullivan Orchards has become a model that other farms can follow. And Morrison Land and Development has proven that heritage agriculture partnerships can succeed at scale. The partnership had also strengthened Jake's relationship with Emma, who had become increasingly involved in Sullivan Orchards operations during her university breaks. Her agricultural business coursework provided valuable perspectives on marketing strategies, financial planning, and operational efficiency that complemented Jake's practical farming experience. "I want to be part of this when I graduate," Emma had announced during spring break, surprising Jake with the decisiveness of her commitment. "What you and Cat have built here is exactly the kind of agricultural innovation that I want to spend my career supporting." Emma's decision to focus her senior year studies on heritage agriculture had created new opportunities for Sullivan Orchards to collaborate with the University of Georgia's agricultural research programs. Dr. Rodriguez had proposed establishing a research plot at Sullivan Orchards that would study heritage variety adaptation to climate change, providing valuable data while generating additional revenue for the farm. Academic partnerships could become another revenue stream, Emma explained. Research institutions need access to heritage varieties for their studies, and farms like ours need the credibility that comes from university collaboration. The prospect of Emma joining Sullivan Orchards permanently had influenced Jake's long-term planning in ways he hadn't expected. Instead of seeing himself as the potentially final Sullivan to farm the family land, he began envisioning a future where the heritage agriculture program would continue to evolve. Under the next generation's leadership, Emma brings skills that I don't have, Jake told Cat. Her understanding of agricultural business principles, marketing strategies, and research methodologies could take Sullivan Orchards to levels I never imagined. The anticipation of Emma's graduation and return to the farm had also prompted discussions about expanding Sullivan Orchards operations to include additional heritage varieties beyond peaches. Morrison Land and Development had identified several heirloom apple and pear varieties that could thrive in North Georgia's climate while diversifying the farm's product offerings. Diversification reduces risk while expanding market opportunities, Dr. Kim explained during discussions about potential expansion. Heritage apple varieties are particularly valuable because they extend your harvest season and attract different customer segments. Jake's personal evolution had been most evident in his relationship with the broader agricultural community, where he had once felt isolated and defensive about his family's struggling operation. He now found himself at the center of conversations about the future of farming in North Georgia. Jake Sullivan has become one of our most important voices for agricultural innovation, observed Dr. Martinez from the Georgia Agricultural Extension Service. His success with heritage agriculture is inspiring other farmers to consider alternatives to conventional commodity production. The recognition within the agricultural community had led to Jake's appointment to the North Georgia Agricultural Preservation Board, where he advocated for policies that would support heritage farming and protect agricultural land from development pressure. It's ironic, Jake reflected. A year ago, I was worried about losing the farm to foreclosure. Now I'm helping develop strategies to preserve farming throughout the region. As spring planting season approached, Jake found himself anticipating the future with confidence that had been missing from his life for years. Sullivan Orchards was financially stable, operationally efficient, and positioned for continued growth. His partnership with Cat Morrison was flourishing both professionally and personally. Emma's impending return promised to bring new energy and expertise to the family operation. Most importantly, Jake had discovered a sense of purpose that extended beyond simply preserving his family's farm. Sullivan Orchards had become a demonstration that heritage agriculture could thrive in modern markets, providing a model that other farms could adapt to their own situations. Grandfather would be amazed by what we've accomplished, Jake told Emma during one of their weekend planning sessions. But I think he'd also understand that we honored his legacy by being willing to change when change was necessary. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early March, just as Jake was finishing his second cup of coffee and preparing to begin spring pruning operations. Kat Morrison's voice carried an excitement that immediately captured his attention, though her words initially seemed too good to be true. "Jake, I need you to sit down for this conversation," Kat said, barely containing her enthusiasm. Southern Living magazine wants to feature Sullivan Orchards as their cover story for the September issue. The theme is Heritage Agriculture Renaissance, and they want to showcase your transformation as the centerpiece article. Jake set down his coffee mug carefully, processing the magnitude of what Kat had just told him. Southern Living was legendary in agricultural circles throughout the Southeast, with a readership that included millions of people interested in food, farming, and rural lifestyle topics. A cover story would represent exposure that money couldn't buy and credibility that would permanently establish Sullivan Orchards as a leader in heritage agriculture. "How did this happen?" Jake asked, still struggling to believe the news. "Marcus Chen's photography from your farm caught the attention of their agricultural editor," Kat explained. She's been following heritage agriculture trends and thinks Sullivan Orchards represents the perfect combination of family tradition, agricultural innovation, and economic success. They want to document your entire story, from near foreclosure to becoming a heritage agriculture showcase. The magazine's interest had been triggered by Sullivan Orchards' inclusion in Morrison Land and Development's documentary project, which had been submitted to several agricultural film festivals and had generated significant attention within the industry. The documentary's combination of compelling personal narrative and solid business results had attracted interest from media outlets looking for positive agricultural stories. "They want to do a 3-day photo shoot in late April when your trees are in full bloom," Kat continued. "Professional photography, interviews with you and Emma, historical background about your family's farming legacy, and detailed coverage of your heritage agriculture program." Jake found himself thinking about his grandfather, who had always been proud of Sullivan Orchard's reputation, but had never imagined that his family's farm might be featured on the cover of a national magazine. The recognition would represent validation that heritage agriculture was more than just a niche market opportunity. It was a viable path forward for family farms throughout the Southeast. "What would this mean for the farm?" Jake asked, beginning to consider the practical implications of national media exposure. "Massive increases in direct sales demand, probably more agritourism visitors than you can accommodate, and recognition that will attract other media attention," Kat replied. "We'll need to prepare for significant expansion of your direct marketing operations." The prospect of handling dramatically increased customer demand was both exciting and daunting. Sullivan Orchard's current direct sales capacity was designed to serve regional customers and a manageable number of restaurant accounts. National exposure could generate demand that would require substantial operational changes. Emma's reaction when Jake called to share the news was immediate and practical. "This is incredible, but we need to be ready for it," she said. "Increased demand means we'll need better inventory management, expanded processing capacity, and probably additional staff during peak seasons." Her agricultural business coursework had prepared her to understand the challenges that accompanied rapid growth, and she immediately began developing plans for managing the anticipated expansion. "We should probably coordinate with Morrison Land and Development to make sure we can handle whatever level of response the article generates." The 3 months between Southern Living's commitment and their planned photo shoot passed in a blur of preparation activities. Jake worked with Dr. Kim to ensure that Sullivan Orchards would look its absolute best. During the magazine's visit, timing pruning operations, infrastructure improvements, and landscape maintenance to coincide with peak spring beauty. Get coordinated with the magazine's editorial team to develop story angles that would showcase both Sullivan Orchard's transformation and the broader potential for heritage agriculture throughout the Southeast. The article would include sidebar features about heritage variety preservation, organic farming techniques, and the economic benefits of direct marketing strategies. This article could influence agricultural policy discussions at the state and federal level, Kat observed. When people see that heritage agriculture is generating real economic results, it becomes much easier to advocate for supportive programs and funding. Marcus Chen spent additional time at Sullivan Orchards during March and April, capturing seasonal changes and documenting activities that would illustrate the complexity and sophistication of heritage farming operations. His photographs would provide visual evidence that heritage agriculture represented serious business rather than nostalgic hobby farming. The Southern Living team arrived on April 23rd, coinciding perfectly with the peak bloom period for Sullivan Orchards Alberta trees. Jake had seen professional photography sessions before, but nothing had prepared him for the scale and intensity of a major magazine production. The crew included the agricultural editor, 2 photographers, a food stylist, and a logistics coordinator who managed equipment and scheduling. They spent 3 days documenting every aspect of Sullivan Orchards operations, from sunrise shots of Jake working among blooming trees to detailed close-ups of heritage fruit characteristics. The visual story is as important as the written narrative, explains Sarah Williams, Southern Living's agricultural editor. Readers need to see the beauty and professionalism of what you've accomplished here. The interview process was extensive and thoughtful, covering Jake's family history, the financial crisis that had threatened the farm's survival, his chance encounter with Cat Morrison, and the step-by-step transformation that had followed. Williams was particularly interested in the specific business metrics that demonstrated heritage agriculture's economic viability. Our readers are intelligent and sophisticated, Williams explained. They want inspiring stories, but they also want practical information they can use. Your financial results prove that heritage agriculture isn't just feel-good farming. It's profitable farming. Emma participated enthusiastically in the interview process, providing perspectives on agricultural education, young farmer retention, and the role of family farms in sustainable food systems. Her combination of practical farming experience and academic training made her an ideal spokesperson for the next generation of agricultural leaders. Emma represents the future of heritage agriculture, Williams observed. Young farmers with business education who understand both tradition and innovation. That's exactly the kind of story our readers want to hear. Cat Morrison was featured prominently in the article as well, with extensive coverage of Morrison Land and Development's partnership model and their success in transforming struggling farms into profitable heritage operations. The magazine's research had confirmed the company's impressive track record and their role in pioneering sustainable agricultural development throughout the Southeast. Cat Morrison is doing for heritage agriculture what others have done for craft brewing or artisanal cheese making, Williams noted. She's proving that traditional methods can succeed in modern markets when they're supported by sophisticated business development. The photo shoot culminated with a cover image that perfectly captured the essence of Sullivan Orchard's transformation. Jake standing among century-old Alberta trees, in full bloom, with the renovated Victorian farmhouse visible in the background and Emma examining heritage fruit beside him. The image conveyed both the timeless beauty of family farming and the professional success of modern heritage agriculture. This cover will be seen by millions of people, Williams told Jake as the photo shoot concluded. Sullivan Orchards is about to become famous throughout the Southeast and beyond. 2 weeks after the Southern Living team departed, Jake received advance copies of the September issue. The cover story was everything Cat had promised. The interview process was extensive and thoughtful, covering Jake's family history, the financial crisis that had threatened the farm's survival, his chance encounter with Cat Morrison, and the step-by-step transformation that had followed. Williams was particularly interested in the specific business metrics that demonstrated heritage agriculture's economic viability. Our readers are intelligent and sophisticated, Williams explained. They want inspiring stories, but they also want practical information they can use. Your financial results prove that heritage agriculture isn't just feel-good farming. It's profitable farming. Emma participated enthusiastically in the interview process, providing perspectives on agricultural education, young farmer retention, and the role of family farms in sustainable food systems. Her combination of practical farming experience and academic training made her an ideal spokesperson for the next generation of agricultural leaders. Emma represents the future of heritage agriculture, Williams observed. Young farmers with business education who understand both tradition and innovation. That's exactly the kind of story our readers want to hear. Cat Morrison was featured prominently in the article as well, with extensive coverage of Morrison Land and Development's partnership model and their success in transforming struggling farms into profitable heritage operations. The magazine's research had confirmed the company's impressive track record and their role in pioneering sustainable agricultural development throughout the Southeast. Cat Morrison is doing for heritage agriculture what others have done for craft brewing or artisanal cheese making, Williams noted. She's proving that traditional methods can succeed in modern markets when they're supported by sophisticated business development. The photo shoot culminated with a cover image that perfectly captured the essence of Sullivan Orchards' transformation. Jake standing among century-old Alberta trees, in full bloom, with the renovated Victorian farmhouse visible in the background and Emma examining heritage fruit beside him. The image conveyed both the timeless beauty of family farming and the professional success of modern heritage agriculture. This cover will be seen by millions of people, Williams told Jake as the photo shoot concluded. Sullivan Orchards is about to become famous throughout the Southeast and beyond. 2 weeks after the Southern Living team departed, Jake received advance copies of the September issue. The cover story was everything Cat had promised and more. 8 pages of stunning photography, detailed narrative about Sullivan Orchard's transformation, and comprehensive information about heritage agriculture's potential for other family farms. The article's headline, From Near Foreclosure to National Recognition, How Heritage Agriculture Saved a Georgia Peach Farm, captured the dramatic nature of Sullivan Orchard's turnaround while highlighting the broader implications for agricultural policy and practice. This changes everything, Emma said after reading the article. We're not just a successful farm anymore. We're a symbol of what's possible when family agriculture adapts to modern market realities. The article's publication in September generated immediate and overwhelming response. Sullivan Orchard's phone began ringing constantly with inquiries from potential customers, other farmers seeking advice, media outlets requesting interviews, and agricultural organizations proposing collaboration opportunities. Online sales demand exceeded Jake's most optimistic projections within the first week of publication. The farm's website, which had been designed to handle modest direct sales volumes, crashed repeatedly under the weight of traffic from customers across the Southeast and beyond, who wanted to purchase authentic heritage peaches. We need emergency expansion of our online sales capacity, Emma told Jake after the third website crash in 2 days. This level of demand is beyond anything we prepared for. Morrison Land and Development's technical team worked around the clock to upgrade Sullivan Orchard's e-commerce systems and implement inventory management procedures that could handle the surge in direct sales activity. Within 2 weeks, the farm was processing online orders from customers in 15 states who were willing to pay premium prices for overnight shipping of fresh heritage peaches. Restaurant demand increased even more dramatically. Chef Amanda Davis from Harvest Restaurant reported that her customers were specifically requesting Sullivan Orchard's peaches after reading the Southern Living article. Similar inquiries came from high-end restaurants throughout the Southeast, many offering to pay premium prices for exclusive access to specific heritage varieties. We've created more demand than we can possibly fulfill, Cat observed during an emergency planning meeting to address the overwhelming response to the magazine coverage. This is a good problem to have, but it's still a problem we need to solve. The solution involved expanding Sullivan Orchard's operations more rapidly than anyone had originally planned, but also developing waiting lists and allocation systems that would manage demand while maintaining the premium positioning that made heritage agriculture profitable. Success brings its own challenges, Jake reflected as he surveyed his orchard, now famous throughout the Southeast as a model for heritage agriculture development. But these are challenges I'd rather have than the ones we faced a year ago. 1. year after the Southern Living cover story transformed Sullivan Orchards from a regional heritage farm into a nationally recognized agricultural showcase. Jake stood on the same front porch where he'd first shaken hands with Cat Morrison, surveying changes that exceeded anything he could have imagined during those desperate months when foreclosure seemed inevitable. The morning view now encompassed not only the original 150-acre peach orchard, but also 40 additional acres that had been purchased and planted with heritage apple and pear varieties. The Victorian farmhouse had been carefully restored to its original grandeur, while incorporating modern amenities that supported the farm's educational and agritourism programs. A new visitor center housed Morrison Land and Development's Southeast Regional Heritage Agriculture Research Center, making Sullivan Orchards the unofficial headquarters for heritage farming throughout the region. Emma had returned from the University of Georgia with her agricultural business degree and had immediately assumed responsibility for Sullivan Orchards' marketing and education programs. Her combination of practical farming experience and formal business training had proven invaluable for managing the complex demands of operating both a working farm and a destination that attracted thousands of visitors annually. The agritourism numbers are incredible, Emma reported during their weekly planning meeting. We're booked solid through next fall. The festival began at sunrise with Jake and Kat leading a tour of the Heritage Orchard. For agricultural officials and media representatives who had traveled from throughout the Southeast to document Sullivan Orchard's continued success, the early morning light illuminated trees heavy with fruit that represented the culmination of 3 years of careful cultivation using methods that honored traditional techniques while incorporating modern understanding of organic agriculture. This is what success looks like in heritage agriculture, Jake told the assembled group as they stood among the century-old foundation trees that had provided the genetic material for Sullivan Orchard's expansion, profitable farming that preserves agricultural heritage while supporting rural communities. The morning tour was followed by workshops that demonstrated specific heritage agriculture techniques, pruning methods that maximize fruit quality, organic pest management protocols, direct marketing strategies that connected farmers with premium customers, and financial planning approaches that supported sustainable operations. Emma led a session specifically designed for young farmers who were considering transitions to heritage agriculture. Her presentation combined practical advice with inspirational stories from Sullivan Orchard's transformation, providing both technical knowledge and emotional support for farmers who were contemplating significant changes to their operations. Heritage agriculture isn't just about preserving old varieties, Emma told the young farmers. It's about creating sustainable businesses that honor the past while embracing the future. Sullivan Orchards proves that it can be done. The afternoon featured the formal harvest ceremony, with Jake and Kat working together to pick fruit from the same century-old trees where their partnership had begun during that first farm tour. 3 years earlier, the symbolic harvest was followed by a tasting that showcased the superior flavor of heritage varieties compared to conventional commercial fruit. This is why heritage agriculture matters, Chef Amanda Davis told the assembled crowd as she prepared dishes featuring Sullivan Orchards peaches. When you taste real fruit with complex flavors developed over generations of careful breeding, you understand what we've lost through industrial agriculture. The tasting was followed by presentations that documented the economic impact of Sullivan Orchards' transformation, employment creation, tax revenue generation, tourism development, and agricultural research contributions that had benefited the entire region. Sullivan Orchards has become a catalyst for rural economic development, announced Mayor Patricia Coleman of Elijah. The farm's success has attracted other agricultural businesses to the area, while establishing our community as a destination for agricultural tourism. As evening approached, Jake found himself standing on the same front porch where he had first met Cat Morrison, looking out over fields that had been transformed from near failure to national recognition through a partnership that had exceeded every expectation either of them had harbored during those initial conversations. The struggling farmer who had pulled a stranger's car from the mud was gone. replaced by an agricultural entrepreneur who understood that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the future of family farming depends on having the courage to embrace change while preserving what matters most. "Thank you," Jake said to Kat as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, "for seeing potential where I saw only problems, for understanding what this place could become, and for giving me the opportunity to preserve my family's legacy while building something larger than either of us could have accomplished alone. Thank you for trusting me," Kat replied, taking his hand as they prepared to join the celebration that continued in the orchard below, for being willing to take risks when risks were necessary, and for proving that heritage agriculture can succeed when it's supported by genuine partnership. Together, they descended from the porch toward the lights and laughter that filled their orchard, where hundreds of people were celebrating not just Sullivan Orchards' success, but the broader movement toward sustainable agriculture that honored the past while embracing the future. The century-old Alberta trees stood as silent witnesses to the transformation that had preserved agricultural heritage, while creating new opportunities for generations of farmers yet to come. In the distance, the ancient mountains of North Georgia rose against a star-filled sky that had witnessed more than a century of Sullivan family farming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was for celebration of what had been accomplished through courage, partnership, and the enduring power of heritage agriculture to transform not just individual farms, but entire communities committed to preserving the best of the past while building toward a more sustainable future. The humble farmer who had pulled a stranger's car from the mud had indeed rewritten his future, but more importantly, he had helped demonstrate that family farming could thrive in the modern world when traditional values were combined with innovative approaches and genuine partnerships built on shared commitment to agricultural heritage preservation. As the celebration continued beneath the heritage trees that had seen near failure transformed into national recognition, Jake understood that this was not an ending, but a new beginning, the start of a movement that would preserve agricultural diversity while supporting rural communities throughout the Southeast and beyond, one family farm at a time, from a chance encounter on a muddy country road to a partnership that transformed both a struggling farm and the broader agricultural landscape. Sullivan Orchards' story demonstrates that sometimes the most unlikely meetings can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. Heritage agriculture had proven that the past and future could work together to create sustainable prosperity for family farms, committed to preserving what matters most while embracing the changes necessary for survival in the modern world.